Listen up, because this isn't your typical galactic history lesson. My name is Jack Reeves, and I've got a story that'll make every diplomat and xenobiologist simultaneously cringe and take notes. Humanity's reputation across the cosmos isn't exactly subtle. We're that species other civilizations whisper about in diplomatic corridors, the wild card that makes seasoned alien strategists develop stress ulcers. Most interstellar species have a polite, measured approach to first contact. We have a strategy best described as hold my beer and watch this. The Galactic Confederation. Yeah, that fancy club of supposedly advanced civilizations likes to pretend they've seen it all. Spoiler alert, they absolutely have not. Not until they met humans, anyway. We're like that one unpredictable friend who shows up to a black tie event wearing cargo shorts and somehow becomes the most fascinating person in the room. Before I dive into the specific incident that shall forever remain known as the incident capitalization, absolutely intentional, let me set the stage. Humanity had been spacefaring for just under a century. We'd made first contact with precisely 3 alien civilizations, and each encounter went about as smoothly as a drunk rhinoceros attempting figure skating. Our first extraterrestrial meeting? A diplomatic disaster that somehow ended with an Andromedan trade delegation, 3 cases of misunderstandings about human humor, and an impromptu karaoke session that technically violated 3 separate interstellar protocols. The second encounter involved a misunderstanding about what constitutes a gift with the Proxima Centauri collective. Turns out, their idea of a welcoming present and our idea were dramatically different. Let's just say it involved a live farm animal, excessive paperwork, and a diplomatic apology that took 6 months to translate. But this is about the third encounter. The one that made even hardened xenodiplomatic veterans look up from their data tablets and go, wait, what? The species in question, who shall remain nameless to protect the thoroughly humiliated, thought they were hot stuff. Advanced technology, thousands of years of continuous civilization, a social structure so complex it made human bureaucracy look like a kindergarten finger painting session. They believed they knew everything about interstellar conflict, negotiation, and strategic maneuvering. Narrators note they did not. What they didn't understand was a fundamental truth about humans: we are profoundly, spectacularly, almost cosmically unpredictable. We view challenges not as obstacles but as personal invitations to do something so absolutely batshit crazy that it defies all known strategic modeling. And so begins the tale of how humanity once again proved that in the grand cosmic comedy, we are definitely not the punchline. We're the entire damn comedy special. First contact. In the history of humanity's interstellar adventures, those 2 words typically preceded some of the most spectacularly awkward moments in cosmic diplomacy. Our encounter with the Krell Imperium was no exception, and by no exception, I mean it was a masterclass in interspecies miscommunication. The Krell were meticulously organized beings. Imagine a civilization where every single action, from breathing to diplomatic negotiations, was calculated with mathematical precision. They stood about 2.5 meters tall, with exoskeletons that looked like a cross between polished obsidian and highly advanced body armor. Each of their 6 limbs moved with synchronized efficiency that would make a Swiss watch look chaotic. Our first meeting happened in the neutral trading zone of Epsilon Nexus, a massive space station that served as the galaxy's most overpriced and bureaucratically complex rest stop. I wasn't personally there, but I've reviewed enough classified reports and witness statements to reconstruct the scene with painful accuracy. Captain Elena Rodriguez, former Marine, current diplomatic liaison, and certified professional chaos agent, represented humanity. She was everything the Krell were not: unpredictable, sarcastic, and wearing a uniform that looked like it had been through several bar fights and a hurricane. Her file noted multiple commendations and an equal number of disciplinary actions, which in the human military basically translated to exceptional performance with occasional administrative headaches. The Krell delegation was led by Executor Varn Ka, their highest-ranking diplomatic representative. Varn Ka had spent decades studying human communication patterns and believed, quite incorrectly, as events would prove, that he understood our species completely. Their initial communication was supposed to be a standard trade and cultural exchange protocol. The Krell had a comprehensive 247-page document detailing every potential interaction scenario. Somewhere around page 43, they had a flowchart for human responses that was so meticulously structured it looked like a mathematical proof. Spoiler alert, none of those flowcharts survived first contact. Greetings, Human Representative Varn Ka began, his translator rendering his clicks and resonant tones into precise English. We have extensively researched your species and believe we can establish mutually beneficial communication protocols. Elena Rodriguez looked him up and down, took a swig from a coffee thermos she absolutely should not have been carrying in an official diplomatic meeting, and responded, "Cool. Want to see a magic trick?" This was not in any Krell communication manual, not even in the appendices. Before Varn K could process the question, Elena had already produced a quarter from her pocket and was demonstrating a coin manipulation that involved what can only be described as physical impossibilities and what veteran diplomats would later call aggressive friendliness. The Krell delegation froze. Their entire communication strategy did not have a subroutine for unexpected manual dexterity demonstration. Varn K's translator, which had been calibrated to handle hundreds of linguistic nuances, briefly stuttered. This was the diplomatic equivalent of a computer blue screen, a total system failure. "I do not comprehend the purpose of this manual intervention," Varn K finally responded, his exoskeleton shifting in what might have been confusion or what passed for Krell body language. Elena just grinned. "It's called building rapport. You want to talk trade? Let's talk trade. But first, magic." What followed was a negotiation session that would go down in interstellar diplomatic records as the most unconventional first contact in recent galactic history. Elena Rodriguez proceeded to negotiate complex trade agreements while intermittently performing coin tricks, telling inappropriate jokes, and drinking what the Krell later discovered was a caffeinated beverage known as espresso. The Krell had prepared for aggressive military posturing. They had strategies for economic warfare, cultural misunderstandings, and potential xenobiological conflicts. What they had not prepared for was a human who treated high-stakes diplomacy like an improvisational comedy routine. By the end of the first day, the Krell delegation's carefully prepared communication matrices looked like they'd been run through a paper shredder, then set on fire, then used as confetti at a particularly wild party. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. Humanity was about to teach them a lesson in unpredictability that would be remembered for generations. And me? I'm just the guy who gets to tell you how it all went down. The thing about the Krell is they don't do surprises. Their entire civilization was built on predictability, mathematical models, and algorithms so precise you could set your quantum clock by them, which made their encounter with humanity particularly challenging. After the initial diplomatic meeting that looked more like a comedy routine than a serious negotiation, the Krell began their standard threat assessment. They compiled data, ran simulations, and tried to understand the fundamental logic behind human behavior. Spoiler alert, they failed spectacularly. Dr. Marcus Holloway, humanity's lead xenopsychologist, a man who looked like he'd been surviving on coffee, conspiracy theories, and pure caffeine-induced chaos, had warned the Galactic Confederation about the fundamental misunderstanding most species had about humans. "We're not just another linear civilization," he'd said in his last conference presentation. "We're a species that sees rules as suggestions, challenges as invitations, and impossibility as a mild inconvenience." The Krell didn't believe him. They were about to learn why they should have. The conflict began subtly. The Krell, believing they had successfully managed the human diplomatic approach, started implementing trade restrictions. They thought they were being clever, creating a set of economic barriers so complex that it would take humans years to navigate. What they didn't understand was that humans view bureaucratic obstacles the way a honey badger views a locked cage, as a personal challenge. Elena Rodriguez, now fully aware that the Krell were attempting to play economic chess, decided to play quantum poker instead. She assembled a team that could only be described as the most gloriously chaotic group of problem solvers in human history. There was Chen Wei, a financial algorithm specialist who looked like a college professor but could deconstruct economic systems faster than most people could order coffee. Alongside her was Diego Ramirez, a former black market trader turned legitimate logistics expert, whose ability to find loopholes was so legendary that several planetary governments had standing restraining orders against him. Their first move was beautifully, horrifyingly elegant. Instead of fighting the Krell's complex trade restrictions directly, they began creating shell corporations, economic proxies, and trading entities so labyrinthine that it would take the Krell decades to untangle them. Wei's algorithms were particularly insidious. She created trading models that looked completely legitimate on the surface but contained nested complexities that would make a quantum physicist weep. Each corporation was a Russian nesting doll of economic complexity, with ownership structures that seemed to defy standard logic. The Krell's first indication that something was wrong came when their economic monitoring system started producing error messages. Not just simple errors, mind you, but the kind of profound computational confusion that suggested someone was playing chess while the system was trying to play tic-tac-toe. Executor Varn Kai called an emergency session of the Krell High Council. Their most advanced economic analysts were brought in, each one looking more bewildered than the last. These human economic constructs, one analyst reported, his exoskeleton vibrating with what passed for anxiety in Krell biology, they do not follow any known economic paradigm. They are simultaneously legitimate and impossible. The humans, meanwhile, were having what they called a strategy meeting, which looked more like a chaotic party with whiteboards, energy drinks, and an alarming number of pizza boxes. "We're not trying to break their system," Elena explained to her team. "We're trying to make it so complicated that they can't even figure out what we're doing." Diego Ramirez, munching on a slice of pepperoni pizza, added, "It's like we're building an economic Rube Goldberg machine. Completely functional, utterly incomprehensible." The Krell's response was predictably linear. They attempted to impose more restrictions, create more barriers. Each time they did, the human team found another way around, another method of economic judo that transformed the Krell's strength into a liability. What the Krell didn't realize was that humans view restrictions not as walls, but as puzzles. Puzzles that come with the implicit challenge, "Bet you can't solve this." And solve it they would. Not through brute force, but through a combination of creativity, audacity, and a complete disregard for what was supposed to be possible. The economic war was heating up, and humanity was just getting started. The Krell thought they were playing a game of strategic containment. They were about to learn that humans don't just play games, they rewrite the entire rulebook. And me? I'm just the narrator, watching this beautiful, terrible chaos unfold. Some moments in history are defined by grand speeches, others by heroic battles. Ours was defined by a combination of caffeine, pure audacity, and what can only be described as weaponized human creativity. The Krell believed they were implementing a comprehensive economic blockade. What they'd actually done was create the most elaborate challenge a human team could possibly receive. And if there's one thing humans love more than winning, it's winning in a way that makes absolutely no sense. Dr. Chen Wei's breakthrough came at 3:47 a.m. after her 17th consecutive espresso and what looked like several hundred algorithm iterations scattered across multiple holographic displays. The team had been operating out of a converted warehouse in Luna's economic zone, a space that looked more like a combination of a tech startup, a military command center, and a college dormitory during finals week. "Got it," she mumbled, her voice simultaneously exhausted and maniacally excited. Diego Ramirez, who had been napping on a beanbag chair surrounded by pizza boxes, snapped awake. "Got what?" "A complete bypass," Wei explained, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. "The Krell's economic restrictions aren't just a barrier. They're a system, and every system has vulnerabilities." What followed was a plan so beautifully complex that it would make bureaucrats weep and mathematicians spontaneously applaud. The humans didn't just want to break through the Krell's economic barriers. They wanted to turn those barriers into a Trojan horse so subtle that the Krell wouldn't realize they'd been outmaneuvered until it was far too late. Captain Elena Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the situation from Luna's diplomatic headquarters, listened to Wei's explanation with a growing smile that was 1 part pride, 2 parts pure mischief. "So basically," Elena summarized, "we're going to make their own restrictive system eat itself." "Precisely," Wei confirmed. The plan was elegant in its complexity. They would create a series of economic entities that would simultaneously comply with and exploit the Krell's restrictions. Each corporation was a nested puzzle, an economic matryoshka doll where compliance was both the mask and the weapon. On the Krell homeworld, Executor Varn Kai was about to have what would become known in diplomatic circles as the worst day in their species' recent history. The first indication something was wrong came when their primary economic monitoring system started producing results that defied logic. Numbers shifted, trade routes appeared and disappeared, and economic flows began moving in patterns that looked less like trade and more like a mathematical fever dream. "Impossible," Varn Kai muttered, his exoskeleton shifting with what could only be described as bureaucratic distress. But it was happening. The human economic team had created a system so ingeniously constructed that it was simultaneously following and subverting every single Krell trade restriction. It was like watching someone solve a Rubik's Cube by basically convincing the cube to solve itself. Diego Ramirez, watching the global economic systems through his custom-built monitoring interface, started laughing. Not a small chuckle, but a full-blown, slightly unhinged laugh of pure professional appreciation. They have no idea, he said to no one in particular. They are so utterly screwed. The beauty of the human approach was its fundamental unpredictability. The Krell had spent generations creating an economic system based on prediction, mathematical models, and absolute control. Humans viewed that same system as an invitation to creative chaos. By the time the Krell realized what was happening, their entire economic blockade had been transformed into a mechanism for human expansion. Trade routes they had intended to close had become superhighways of economic activity. Restrictions they had implemented to limit human influence had become the very conduits of that influence. It wasn't just a victory. It was a masterclass in turning limitations into opportunities. And the truly terrifying part? To the humans, this wasn't even their most impressive achievement. This was Tuesday. The Krell were about to learn a fundamental truth about humanity: we don't just adapt. We absolutely relish the opportunity to turn someone else's carefully laid plans into our personal playground. Buckle up. Because this was about to get interesting. The aftermath of humanity's economic judo against the Krell was nothing short of legendary. And by legendary, I mean the kind of story that would be told in diplomatic circles for generations, accompanied by nervous laughter and a collective shudder. Executor Varn Kai's official report to the Galactic Confederation was a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. It ran 372 pages, contained 17 separate appendices, and essentially boiled down to: we have no idea what just happened, but it was definitely the humans' fault. The Krell High Council convened an emergency session that lasted 3 standard galactic weeks. Their top economists, strategists, and diplomatic experts spent countless hours trying to understand how a single human team had completely dismantled their most sophisticated economic defense mechanisms. Dr. Marcus Holloway, the xenopsychologist who had predicted this exact scenario, was contacted by the Confederation's diplomatic corps. His response was a single video message that consisted of him taking a long sip of coffee, raising an eyebrow, and saying, "Told you so." The economic fallout was extraordinary. What the Krell had intended as a restrictive blockade had been transformed into the most elaborate economic expansion pathway in recent galactic history. Human corporations, or more accurately, the labyrinthine network of economic entities created by Chen Wei and Diego Ramirez, had effectively backdoored themselves into markets the Krell had sworn to keep closed. Elena Rodriguez was called to a series of diplomatic hearings. Most species expected her to be defensive, to provide technical explanations or complex justifications. Instead, she showed up wearing what can only be described as business casual, with a hint of "I just solved a problem you couldn't even comprehend." Any questions she'd ask after each hearing, with a smile that was equal parts challenge and amusement. The Krell's attempt to save face was almost adorable. They tried to frame the entire incident as a mutually beneficial misunderstanding. It was like watching a toddler try to explain why there was jam on the ceiling. Technically explanatory, completely unconvincing. But here's the real kicker: the humans didn't just win. They won in a way that left the entire Galactic Confederation slightly traumatized and deeply confused. Diego Ramirez, in a rare moment of public speaking, summed it up best during a trade conference. "We don't see barriers," he explained to a room full of increasingly nervous alien diplomats. "We see puzzles waiting to be solved." The economic ripple effects were profound. Planetary governments that had previously been locked out of certain trade routes suddenly found themselves with unprecedented access. Markets that had been stagnant for centuries began to show signs of life. The Krell's attempt to create a restrictive economic environment had inadvertently become the most aggressive form of market liberation in recent galactic history. Chen Wei, meanwhile, was offered positions by no less than 47 different governmental and private entities. She turned them all down, preferring to continue working with her team. When asked why, she simply smiled and said, "Why would I want to work anywhere else? Where else could I have this much fun?" The Krell never fully recovered their reputation as the galaxy's most precise economic strategists. Every time a Krell diplomat attempted to implement a complex trade restriction, someone would inevitably whisper, "Remember the humans." It became a running joke in diplomatic circles, a shorthand for "be careful what barriers you try to create, because someone might just turn them into an opportunity." Humanity's reputation shifted. We were no longer just the new, unpredictable species. We were the species that could turn economic warfare into an art form, diplomacy into a cosmic comedy, and limitations into launching pads. And me? I'm just the narrator, watching a species continue to defy every single expectation placed upon it. Just another Tuesday in human history. Some stories end with profound statements. some with dramatic revelations. Ours ends with a simple truth: humanity doesn't just change the game. We rewrite the entire rulebook, then use the old rules as confetti. Years after the Krell incident, as it became known in diplomatic circles, the galactic perception of humanity had fundamentally shifted. We were no longer the new kids on the interstellar block. We were the unpredictable force that made seasoned alien strategists develop spontaneous stress ulcers. The Galactic Confederation developed an unofficial addendum to their first contact protocols. It was never officially published, but every diplomat knew it existed. The human subsection could be summarized in one-line approach with caution. Assume nothing. Expect everything. Dr. Marcus Holloway, our favorite xenopsychologist, was invited to more conferences than he could count. His lectures became legendary, part academic presentation, part stand-up comedy routine that left alien diplomats simultaneously terrified and fascinated. Humanity, he would often say, is not a species. We're a cosmic wildcard. The Krell, for their part, developed an entire branch of diplomatic studies dedicated to understanding human behavior. Their research facilities were filled with case studies, algorithmic models, and increasingly desperate attempts to create a predictive framework for human actions. They might as well have tried to mathematically model a hurricane using a crayon and wishful thinking. Elena Rodriguez eventually became the youngest human appointed to the Galactic Diplomatic Corps' senior leadership. Her office wall featured a collection of diplomatic challenge coins from various species, each one a testament to a negotiation that had gone sideways in the most spectacular fashion possible. Chen Wei and Diego Ramirez continued their work, becoming something of legendary figures in economic strategy. Their team was sought after by governments and corporations across multiple star systems, not for their technical expertise, but for their ability to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. And the galaxy? The galaxy learned a fundamental lesson about humanity. We are not a species that accepts limitations. We are a species that sees restrictions as personal challenges, bureaucracy as a puzzle to be solved, and the impossible as a mild inconvenience. Other civilizations build walls. We build catapults. They create systems of control. We create systems of opportunity. The Krell incident became more than just a historical event. It became a metaphor, a warning, and ultimately a celebration of human ingenuity. Years later, when young diplomats and strategists would ask about the incident, the older generations would just smile. A knowing, slightly terrifying smile that suggested they knew something the youngsters didn't. Because some stories aren't just about what happened. They're about what humanity represents. We don't just adapt. We transform. We don't just survive. We thrive. And we do it with a cup of coffee in one hand and an absolutely ridiculous plan in the other. Just another day in human history.